Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about the 5 days that I spent on the Route Verte in Quebec, the province of Quebec, Canada. And I'll talk about the amenities, the accommodation, the logistics, and the costs of the trip, as well as some of the things I liked, didn't like, and what I learned along the way. If you're new here, my name is Kyria and I'm an avid backpacker and bikepacker. And in 2024, I quit my job to pursue a life of travel and adventure. Let's get started. First, let's talk about how I planned the route. If you're new here, you may not know this, but basically I rode all the way from California, trying to get to Nova Scotia by the time the snow started to fly. So I basically was falling a little bit behind because I had visited some friends and needed a little bit of a break, so I did some house sitting and stuff. So I did a house sit in Montreal, and my next leg was to get from Montreal somehow to Nova Scotia. And at this point, I had to reassess my route and the time that I had left and figure out more of a direct route along the way. So I did look into going back through the US to get there, as well as continuing on through Quebec City and on to New Brunswick. But all in all, I realized that I was going to run out of time and I needed to get to Nova Scotia by the end of October. And so I was going to have to kind of hustle a little bit more than I had planned. So because of this, I decided to just take the quickest route possible. I had originally planned on taking the Great Northern Bikepacking route, which goes kind of from Ottawa to Quebec City up a little bit higher north through the forests and stuff like that. But by this point, I had decided to do the house sitting in Montreal and then had decided that I was not going to beat the weather like I thought I was going to, so I needed to move a little bit faster than I would if I was doing a dirt trail bikepacking trip. So that is where the Route Verte came into play, and they have a great website, and so you can easily plan out your trip. But all in all, I think it's about 54 kilometers worth of trails. Of course, I would only be doing a small section. One thing I considered at this point was taking the ferry, which you can do from either Maine or New Brunswick into Nova Scotia. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in my Nova Scotia briefing, but basically it wasn't going to work out. And so I decided in the end to take the train and skip New Brunswick, unfortunately, and just take the train from Quebec City to Halifax and then go to my final destination, which was going to be Wolfville, Nova Scotia, where I have some friends. Let's talk about when I did this route. So I did this route in mid-October, and as you can see from the videos, that meant pretty cold mornings, medium cold days, and lots of nice fall colors. But it was clear skies and just a little bit chilly. I would say during the day it was getting into the mid-40s, and at night it was getting either at or a little bit below freezing at times. I'm going to try to walk and talk and do this. So let's talk about amenities. Amenities were actually very easy to come by. You go through plenty of little small towns, as well as a few bigger ones along the way. And so I had absolutely no trouble getting food or water. I did have my filter. There were streams, but I didn't even need to use it. And there were tons of grocery stores and restaurants and everything else. So amenities were not a problem at all on this stretch of the route. So what about accommodation? Again, accommodation also not a problem. And in Quebec, and along the Route Verte, there are bed and breakfast, B&Bs, as well as regular normal-sized hotels and camping options. However, for me, the camping options weren't really set where I wanted to go based on my amount of mileage per day. So I didn't really utilize the camping. And for wild camping, there's not really a lot of options for wild camping, unless you want to stealth camp, which is not really my style. So let's talk about the costs. For accommodation, I spent $666. This was for 5 nights in a hotel, so that's an average of about $109 a night. For dining out, I spent about $86, and for groceries, I spent $149. All in all, that means that the total food cost per day was roughly $12.35. This does include the days that I was house sitting as well. For shopping, I spent $19. That was just on toiletries. And for transportation around the city of Montreal, I spent $14. So obviously, if you're planning a bike trip and you're not going to be using the public transportation, you won't incur those costs. So that brings my total amount spent to about $934, which is about $49 a day if you include the house sitting. Obviously, if you divided that only by the 5 days, that would be almost $200 a day. So what was the best part of this trail? The best part was the Route Verte was very nicely marked. The roads that you go on are nice roads with either a shoulder or very, very low traffic or a bike lane. So the route itself was quite nice. A lot of the times it went along the St. Lawrence River, so it was very picturesque. And of course, there were the beautiful fall colors. The little towns you go through are very cute, very quaint, little churches in them, and just a very nice scenery the entire way. Of course, this was middle of October, so it was a little chilly, but I won't fault Quebec for that. That's my own fault for being so late in the game. What was the hardest part, or the thing I didn't like? I would say there wasn't really too much of a hard part. It's a pretty flat route. I think I had barely any elevation, and like I said, it kind of just goes along the river for much of it. The only thing that there was a little bit of was wind. I mean, and it usually wasn't a tailwind, of course, but it wasn't really anything that really detracted from my day at all. The weather was nice. It didn't rain at all. The fall colors were nice. So all in all, even though it was, like I said, a little bit cold, the wind wasn't super cold, and so it wasn't really unpleasant or anything. The other thing I would say, I guess, would be hard, if you want to call it that, was that there weren't a lot of wild camping opportunities. So of course, this drives up the price, and also it just means you're going through a little bit more built up areas. But again, that's my own fault, because I was going to go through the woods, but instead I ended up going through more civilization than I had anticipated in the beginning. What I learned along the way were, I did stay in some hotels, some chain hotels, because I had some points and stuff like that, some discounts that I had already built up for those chain hotels. But I think the experience would be a lot better if you're going to do this, if you stay more in the bed and breakfast or smaller establishments. Most of them, and you can look at the Route Verte website for this, you can plan all of the accommodation ahead of time, but most of them have bike parking, and a lot of, they're very bike friendly. And so it really would be a lot more fun if you were staying in more of a local kind of place and getting to know the local, feel a little bit more. However, the hotels I did stay in were very accommodating. They all let me bring my bike inside. And like I showed you in the video, the one I stayed in Berthierville had a little bike stand that you could park your bike inside the room with the stand. So that was kind of nice. The other thing I learned, because in Berthierville there were only a few food options, so I decided to try the McDonald's poutine just for fun. And I learned that the McDonald's poutine is not the best poutine I've ever had, but it is actually not the worst poutine I've ever had either. So it wasn't too bad. What could I have not lived without? Well, it wasn't raining, but I did wear my rain jacket a lot because it was starting to get colder. And on the same kind of vein, I wore my buff a lot and my gloves. So it definitely was good that I had been carrying around all this winter gear for so long, because I did start to use it again. The other thing that I could not live without is my fanny pack and a packable grocery bag. So not as important when you're camping in the woods more, but when you start going through more developed areas, oftentimes you are needing to go into stores and stuff and go shopping more. And so this is an easy way for me to have all my valuables kind of with me already, and also have a bag that I can just whip out and go grocery shopping without having to unpack any of my bags that are on my bike. So would I be back? Definitely. I really enjoyed, I don't really love road riding or pavement riding or tarmac riding, whatever you call it, but I really enjoyed the fact that the bike lanes were good, the infrastructure was good, and the route took me through a lot of cute little towns, so I got to see the countryside. So even though it wasn't exactly what I had imagined it was going to be, it was a really nice ride. I'd love to go back, do some more riding, hopefully not on pavement, but maybe see more of the provincial parks and whatnot. But also, even the pavement riding is not completely horrible. I've definitely had worse. So I will be back to Quebec someday to do some more riding there. So I think I pretty much covered it. If you have any questions, as always, don't forget, just leave them in the comments and I will be sure to answer them. And I will also be doing a Q&A at the very end once I've wrapped everything up, so that I can answer any questions that I haven't addressed in any prior videos. But if you haven't already, please subscribe. And once again, thank you very much for watching, and happy trails. Testing. This is testing the light and the microphone. Testing. Hi, and welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about... No, I don't like it.